Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The California 100 Initiative is an attempt to identify what the state might look like in the next 100 years. One of those key policy domains is the future of California's agriculture. Our guest is Cal Poly professor Anastasia Telesetsky. She's here to discuss her report on the future of California agriculture for California 100. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks very much for having me today.
You know, I just was wondering, can you give us some figures on the role of California, both nationally and internationally?
Sure. So if you ate some fresh produce today, you probably ate it from California. We are a major producer. As everyone knows, we produce about $49.1 billion worth of agricultural value in the state. Those are 2021 numbers. And we are a major exporter to all of the other 49 states, plus, of course, internationally. In particular, we're the number 1 producer of milk products and nuts and fruit.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The Valley obviously is a huge part of that. So what role does the Central Valley play in agriculture?
About 2/3 of our agricultural production is coming out of the Central Valley, so it's huge. And most of our irrigated land, about 75% of California's irrigated land is in the Central Valley. I mean, we'll be talking about it later. There's some challenges with that, of course, with water scarcity and water pressures.
And you always see in the Valley the different counties competing with each other as to which is the number 1 ag county. I think most recently Fresno County was the number 1 ag county, but sometimes you see Tulare or Kern or some other counties kind of step in there. Also, it's almonds are particularly big, in the Central Valley.
Huge. We used to produce a lot more row crops, but a lot of that's been substituted now for orchards and more permanent crops, which has its own pressures because as you put in trees, you can't not irrigate trees. You're not going to be able to keep
the reason why obviously they're putting them in is because there's a higher return on their investment. They're a high value product or crop. Let me ask you this. What does a typical California farm look like? Are they predominantly large corporate farms? Are they small family farms?
Well, we've got about 70,000 farms here in the state, and most of them are family farms. Most of them are relatively small farms that are producing for the regional economy. We have a few very large farms here in California. So the statistics are that around 7% of California's family farms produce about 60% of the output. So
yeah, I was interested when I was reading. I'm sorry. I was interested when I was reading your report that 93% are family-owned and small farms. That's between 1 and 49 acres. That kind of struck me because you think, oh, that's all these big corporate farms. That's not the case at all. And you also look at the commodity sales. A lot of these farms are making less than $100,000. So
that's right.
They're kind of small operations, which I think would surprise a lot of people. So when you take a closer look at California farms, what's the demographic breakdown in terms of young, old, male, female, white, non-white? What does it look like?
Yeah, as of today, I mean, most of the principal producers, so those are the people kind of running the farm, making a lot of the decisions, or the owners of the farm, are primarily white, male, and older. We don't have particularly, in terms of when we look at California demographics, we don't have a proportional number of Black, Indigenous, people of color producers and primary producers. About 21%, around between, depending on the statistics, 17%, 21%. So that's relatively small. There's a lot of reasons for that. Having a farm is a big capital investment. So if you're wanting to get into farming today in California, it's pretty expensive to be able to buy agricultural land. So what we're seeing is there is interest in farming from lots of different groups, but getting access to farm land and to the ability, farm resources, equipment and whatnot, it is quite challenging for many.
Are they trying to address that issue to bring more, people of color, into farming, making, for example, finance capital easier to get to acquire?
There are some programs for that, but not particularly at scale. I mean, this remains really kind of a barrier of access, and including for in terms of demographics, particularly young farmers.
Right.
And the future of farming, we need farmers, and so this is an area where the state could definitely do well to put more investment.
Yeah, you were mentioning in your report that there aren't a lot of farm owners under 35. I mean, it's typically an older white population, so that has to be addressed if farming is going to be viable going into the future. But up next, we're going to talk about another big part of agriculture, and that is farm labor, ag labor. What's the situation when it comes to farm labor in California farms? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. There's no question that farm workers are the backbone of California agriculture. What are the specifics when it comes to their contributions? We're talking with Cal Poly professor Anastasia Telesetsky, who recently authored a report on the future of California agriculture and food systems for California 100. That's an initiative that's exploring the future of the state's critical policy areas. So turning our attention to farm labor, how many farm workers are there in California, and approximately how many of those are undocumented?
That's a good question. We don't know. We don't know how many farm workers there are because of visas, whether it's many of the farm workers, of course, have visas. Some farm workers are, of course, American citizens and residents. We have, in terms of Department of Labor statistics, about 407,000 agricultural workers. That's a pretty big category. Of those, around like 158,000 are working on crops. But we don't actually know how many folks are working here. Some previous studies indicated about 50% of farm workers may or may not have a visa and be documented.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out that number because they're undocumented, and so they're not reporting. And I've seen numbers as high as 60% that are undocumented, but it is hard to get a handle on that. I'm assuming that most of these farm workers are coming from Central America and then even more specifically Mexico.
Yeah, most of them are coming from Latin America. They tend to be young men in particular coming from Latin America and providing critical services for our food system, for our food supply.
And there have been some attempts, to kind of deal with that in terms of allowing them to go back and forth across the border. I think I read something in your report, something about these blue cards they're talking about allowing ag workers to come here. If they're here for 8 years, then they could apply for citizenship at some point. But it gets tied up with all the politics with immigration. And though it's interesting, you do see it's a very interesting political situation where the United Farm Workers and some of the big corporate farm interests are supportive, like on the California Farm Bureau, are supportive of a program like this because they know it's the lifeblood to their industry. But I guess we're still waiting to see if that's ever going to happen. One criticism of agriculture is that they rely on these undocumented low-wage workers. What's the average wage of a California farm worker, and do these jobs come with benefits?
Yeah, the wage is low for living here in California, given a high cost of living. So Department of Labor tells us that the sort of average wage for agricultural workers is around about $15.25. It's lower for field workers, in particular crop workers. And anecdotally, some workers are receiving even less than that, significantly less than that. It depends on the farm. It depends on the farm what the kind of benefits are that are available. And so there is a huge range of experiences for farm workers, which becomes highly problematic because farms that for a variety of reasons may not be able to provide benefits are unlikely to have a reliable labor force.
Right.
And that's been a real pinch point for
Yeah,
our
and you're seeing more farms. These workers are specialized in various crops or whatever. So that becomes kind of important. California law was recently amended to allow overtime for farm workers. I'm just wondering what impact has that had on farm workers? Does that help them or hurt them? Increasing overtime rates obviously means more pay, but it also means maybe we're going to mechanize and not have as many farm workers because they're more expensive?
Yeah, I mean, it depends again on the farm, and some farms are, assigning less hours to their workers, which may indeed mean less take-home pay. I mean, the big complication that I sort of want to point to here is the pricing of our food. There's a lot that's not in the price of our food when it hits the supermarket. So we're not necessarily paying for the human labor that goes into food, and we're also often not paying for some of the environmental externalities associated with food
Right. It's
production.
not all captured in the price of an apple.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, there is a move afoot to allow farm workers to unionize. There are less than 1% of the labor force, workforce is unionized.
Mm.
Uh, Basically allowing them to do something called card check, which means they sign a card, and a majority of them sign a card, they have a union, as opposed to having an election, which United Farm Workers unions would say that workers get intimidated, so card check is less intimidating. On the other hand, on the corporate side, like Cal Chamber and the Western Growers, are very much opposed to this. What do you think the impact of that bill is going to have?
Well, it remains to be seen what the impact will be, but I think one of the components of that bill involving sort of the appeals process will be quite interesting here, because one of the concerns has been that, at least on behalf of some of the workers, there's been concerns of intimidation. And now, if there's going to be an order from the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, if a owner operator wants to appeal that, they need to put forward a appeal bond. So that will mean that they think they have a legitimate case. So we won't have kind of frivolous cases being brought against workers, and so that could in fact be an improvement for agricultural labor.
I guess we're going to see. Well, up next, anyone who's lived in the valley has probably seen the signs. Agriculture grows where water flows. A look at the natural resource needs of California agriculture next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Cal Poly professor Anastasia Telesetsky about a report she recently wrote for California 100 on the future of California's agricultural industry and food systems in general. So, water, central part, obviously, of California ag. That's kind of a given. What are the numbers? I mean, let's put this in perspective. How much water does California use? My understanding is about 40% of the state's available water to irrigate about 9 million crops. I think I have my numbers right. Quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, food production depends on water, and it's probably our biggest limiting factor here in the state in terms of production. And we can talk a little bit more about it. We draw on surface water, we draw on groundwater, and we basically don't have enough surface or groundwater at this point to meet the needs of the crops that we have in the field.
Yeah, it seems like when you look at the water issue, which is a very complex issue, it seems like we've overpromised. We've promised something to ag, we've promised something to the environmental groups, we promised something to the city, but there's only so much water, and so it seems like everybody has to take a step back to deal with the water that we do have. And then climate change has those implications. But one of the big issues here is water rights. I mean, those are pretty complicated.
They are super complicated. So we have a system that includes riparian rights, which basically means you get a right because of the location of your land. And then we've got all those appropriative rights, which are historical rights. The whole system is super complicated in terms of who gets what in any given year, because you've got senior water right users and you've got junior water right users. And in a year that you've got a drought, there are going to be people who are not going to get water. And that means that they're going to have to make some hard decisions.
The very first issue I had as a lawyer many, many years ago in Connecticut was about an issue of a school district and an issue with riparian rights. I remember when the partner came to me, he said, you have to work on riparian rights for the school district. I said, first of all, I got to figure out what is a riparian. So it was unusual when I was in Connecticut. It is very common here in California. Obviously, there's a big reliance on groundwater, and particularly during drought years. Now, the states enacted something to balance groundwater called SGMA, Groundwater Management Act. What can you tell us about the current state of groundwater in California?
Yeah, I mean, right now, Sigma is our legal effort to try to create some sort of rational approach to groundwater extraction. We basically, in a number of areas, particularly agricultural centers, have overdrafted. We've taken too much groundwater. We're not getting enough recharge. So each of the areas right now, they're trying to put together a groundwater sustainability plan. And this is happening, but it's happening slowly. And that's been tricky because, year by year, farmers are having to still make decisions about what they're going to do with their crops. Because we have basically 83% of our groundwater went to ag use between 2011 and 2016. And we're likely, given sort of climate disruption, we're likely to see more drought years. And
Right. And when they over pump, there's issues like subsidence, which means the land sinks and all of a sudden roads are sinking and canals are sinking and all kinds of other peripheral issues. Let me ask you this. Let's kind of change gears a little bit. Let's talk about energy.
Sure.
What are the energy needs for agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, the California agriculture sector, it uses a fair amount of energy primarily for things like groundwater pumping and making sure that we can get this water from the north of the state to the south of the state. A lot of that, of course, is fossil fuel based. I mean, we're beginning to see some transitions. We're beginning to see some farms try to become more self-sufficient in terms of their energy uses, whether that's using some solar or using uh, biogas. But that's, once again, a process. And farmers are trying to do what they can right now to make these transitions.
So what do you see then as the major trends here? You've got climate change and all these other things that are impacting agriculture. What do you see as the major trends in California agriculture going forward?
It's about figuring out how to share the water that there is. I mean, that's the big question right now because we've got areas, the Colorado River was at historic lows last year. What that meant for the Imperial Irrigation District was that they had to make some hard decisions about what they do with the water that they did get. And so that to me is where the action is trying to figure out rational water policy. And you've got the State Water Resources Control Board, and the other state water agencies, they're putting out a whole lot of ideas, and it's really important at this point that the agricultural sector is part of that conversation.
That's a great segue to our next segment. We're going to talk about California agriculture being at the proverbial fork in the road. What do we do? What's the government's response? What's the agricultural industry's response? And what happens if we make the wrong choice or no choice at all? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Cal Poly professor Anastasia Telesetsky about a report she wrote on the future of California agriculture. In your report, you lay out 4 scenarios for the future of California agriculture. 2 happen to be positive, 2 happen to be negative. So let's start with the negative ones first. The first one, negative one, you refer to as the, quote, Canadian tomatoes and Mexican avocados. Very, very colorful way to describe it. But in short, this would happen if California fails to adapt to the challenges facing California agriculture. What factors drive this situation? What are the current signals that this may be happening?
Yeah, so this scenario says that we have enough water, but we've failed to adapt to climate change, which basically means that we're not able to produce the scope and array of food products that we typically produce. We're importing food. It's the importing food scenario. And it means that we've chosen to do other things with waters. It's not all bad. It means that farmers may be able to use their land for important ecological restoration work, but it's certainly not about food production for California.
Yes. If you go to the food market, you see, avocados from Mexico, just like you're saying. So, maybe we're seeing a little bit of that already. The second possible negative scenario you refer to as, quote, selling the farm, unquote, another colorful phrase. This would really be the product of procrastination. California loses both water and farm production because it failed to make choices in a timely manner. So what are some of the factors that would drive us to this situation? What are the current signals that this may be happening?
Yeah, I mean, this is the inaction scenario. This is that we don't reform our water policy and we don't take the steps that we are anticipating taking to react to climate change by doing adaptive moves. This is bleak. This is bleak. This means that California will no longer be a producer, and nor will it have any other alternatives. For those lands.
Yeah, yes, this is a very bleak scenario. And one thing I would argue is that California agriculture is a national security issue. I mean, you don't want to be overly dependent on other countries for anything, whether it's energy or agriculture. And so this is, hopefully that's the direction we are not headed in. Let's talk a little more positive. You have two positive scenarios. One you refer to as the land of milk and honey. That sounds pretty nice. What would that look like? What are the future drivers for that scenario? And what are some of the signals that we might be seeing that happening?
This is the scenario that we've accelerated our effort on water policy and on climate adaptation. And this means that we're going to see a lot of good stuff happening. We're going to see alternative proteins in our market. We're going to see efforts because we'll have enough water. We'll see robotic agriculture as part of this movement. This is where we hope that we'll put our investments as a state. And I encourage folks to read the report, and there's a number of different developments that we've sort of highlighted in that report.
That is a very good point. You can just Google it. You can find the report. We try to summarize it for you here, but yeah, reading the report is really what you want to do. Let me ask you this. So what's the fourth scenario you talk about here is something called Innovation Nation. Also sounds pretty good. And also sounds a lot like California, right? We're usually on the cutting edge of things. What would that scenario look like? What are the future drivers for that? And what are the current signals that maybe we're seeing that already starting to happen?
Yeah, so this is basically looking at sort of venture capital investing in our agricultural sector. And we are indeed seeing some of this happening with all sorts of agricultural machinery, with robotics, trying to figure out how we can use more artificial intelligence in sort of field crop production. This is indoor farming. This is the world of the Jetsons, where our food production is very much mechanized. Whether this will be a good thing or not, because this has challenges for labor, that remains also to be seen. I'd like to live in the land of milk and honey personally, so I'm hoping we get our climate policy and our water policy right.
Yeah, but you're right, though. I mean, in terms of labor, it's going to change with increased mechanization. It's going to have to be more training and more skills. We've only got about 10, 15 seconds left, but so which one do you think is going to happen?
I would think that we can still work towards land of milk and honey. I think we can get water policy right. I mean, we're seeing some good stuff happening right now with folks who weren't necessarily cooperating 10 years ago, figuring out how do we do groundwater recharge.
Well,
yeah.
I'm going to leave it on that very optimistic note. I want to thank Cal Poly professor Anastasia Telesetsky for joining us today. If you want to stay current on local and state politics, you can sign up for the Maddy Daily by logging on to our website at MaddyInstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at MaddyInstitute.org.